Hi, Jesse Williams, Harvesting Specialist with Case IH. We're out at my in-laws farm today. We've got their 8230 out of the barn. We've got the 4408 corn head hooked to the front of it. And we're going to go through this header today and take a look at some tips and tricks to really make this header perform in the field. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to best make it perform if we get into a down crop situation. So to give you a little background on my experience with this head, we ran a pre-build on this machine in 2013. We purchased this head in 2014 and we've run it every year since. So I've got 7 years under my belt running this head. I've run every head that Case IH has built for the last 30 years rather extensively. And I've run a number of competitive heads. And I've been very happy with the job that this head does in the field. The feeding of it, the performance of it, the loss that I find behind this header. So we're going to go through some of the things that I've found over the years running this head and talk about them in this video today. So one of the first things we'll take a look at with our corn head is going to be our header angle. So the angle of this row unit as it's going through the field, and our operator's manual does give us a recommendation on that. So if we pull the operator's manual out, it tells us that we want a deck plate angle of 21 degrees in the operating position. So they're considering that 10 inches off the ground at the front of the stalk roll. So if I measure from about where my bearing is at the front of the stalk roll down to the ground when the machine is sitting on a good level flat surface, set that at 10 degrees, and then I can come in here and check that angle. So a number of different tools for checking that. I've got a digital level here that I can just lay across the top of the chains and check that angle. Now if you have an iPhone or some of your other smartphone devices, typically they have an angle finder in them as well. So in my iPhone, I'll go into the measure app, find the level app, and then I can lay my phone on that deck plate and I can look and see what that deck plate angle is. So when we're looking at deck plate angle, that's going to do a few things for us. As we go steeper with the front of that head, we're more likely to lose crop out of that corn head. So gravity kind of works against us, that crop can come back out the front. As we go a little bit flatter with the head, we're less likely to lose that crop out the front, but we may not be able to get that crop out under the row unit. So as that plant is feeding into the row unit, the tip-to-tip knives are pulling that stalk down, they're cutting that material, and then they're throwing it out underneath. So as I flatten that row unit, I'm throwing that material more straight down. If I angle that row unit forward a little bit, I'm going to throw that material a little bit more to the back of the head, and I'm going to clear that material out behind my row unit. So I'm going to have less issues with picking trashy or potentially plugging up my row units going through the field. When we're taking a look at our header angle and down corn, we may find that we want to roll that feeder faceplate back a little bit more to flatten that profile out a little bit more. So flatten the snoots out, flatten the row units out a little bit, and that's going to make it easier to get that down crop up over the snoots and back into the row units. So with that, we can loosen our bolts on the feeder faceplate. We'll take a look at them in a minute. And with our head sitting on the ground, we'll lower that feeder house down to roll that header back a little bit. Now, if you have one of our new 250 series machines, we do offer them with the optional in-cab adjustable faceplate. So with that, I'm able to hydraulically change the angle of that header from the cab. And with that, I can save those angles to my header preset. So if I'm in a down corn situation, what I may do is when I'm in my down corn, I'm going to set a header height preset so I'm down cutting just as close as I can, and I'm going to roll that header back. When I get into my taller corn, I'm going to raise that header up a little bit so that I'm more running underneath the ear in my standing corn, and I'm going to maybe roll that faceplate ahead a little bit to help get some of that trash down through the row unit, allow me to clip along a little faster through the field. And I can save that with the header preset as well. So that allows me to simply toggle with my resume button, and as I'm raising the head, I tilt it forward a little bit, and as I'm lowering the head, I'm going to roll it back a little bit. So if we're flattening that head out in down corn, a couple of things we want to keep an eye on as we're flattening the head out. And one is going to be the relation of our gathering chains to the ground. So the front of that gathering chain, as we flatten the head, it's actually going to rock up a little bit. We've got a skid shoe underneath the row unit, and as we roll that header backwards, it's going to rock the front up a touch. So it's a little bit of a balancing act as far as how much we can flatten it out versus being able to take the front of the row unit and grab that crop and get it in. So we'll take a look at a couple other things with our row unit while we're right here. So when we look at our gathering chains, you can see these chains are the way they would have come from the factory. We've got those paddles offset, so they're not running tip to tip. I have had really good luck with that. I have done some down corn with that, and it's done a good job. Now, if you're wanting to make that a little bit more aggressive at feeding, we could come in here and we could time these chains tip to tip. So when we time the chains tip to tip, both tips are coming around at the same time. They're a little bit more aggressively going to grab and pull that crop up into the row unit, as well as pushing that trash back towards the auger. So in some cases in trashy conditions, what I have seen people do is they won't go through and time every row, but they'll take their 2 rows in front of the feeder house, they'll time them tip to tip. That helps get that material pushed into that feeder house and moved into the machine. So when we're looking at timing those chains on those row units, couple things that we do. Most of the newer units have this clip in the front here, so that is a stop. It's going to prevent this tensioner from going back, which would possibly allow the chain to jump a tooth, leading to the chains getting out of time. So the early heads didn't have this. This was an add-on for this head. You can get these relatively inexpensive through the parts department. They clip on there. You can pull these off if you need to change a chain or retime your chains. So then we'll take our over center chain tool, and it is designed to clip on the bolt on the front idler sprocket on the front, clip around the strut on the back. And I can push that tool back and release the tension on that chain. Now, it's not a bad idea with your corn head to go through your row units before you go to the field in the fall and just make sure they're all moving freely with this tool. There's no binding in that tensioner. You don't push that front idler back, release the tool, and it sticks there. Especially if we're doing some down corn, that'll minimize our chances of jumping chains when we get in the field if everything is working smoothly on that tensioner assembly. Now, one other thing to take a look at if you're timing those chains is the distance between each of the paddles all the way around the chain isn't the same. So if I look at my connecting links between these 2 paddles, I've got 4 connecting links. If I come back here, between these 2, I have 3 connecting links. So when I'm timing those chains to get them tip to tip, what I want to do is find my 3 connecting links on this chain, my 3 connecting links on the opposing chain, and I want to line them up tip to tip. That'll keep my chain running timed all the way around on both sides. Now, when we look at our row unit, we have made some changes since the earlier heads. We've modified the profile of this deck plate up here a little bit, as well as we have changed the spiral down here. So when we change that spiral on the newer heads, it's more of an intermeshing spiral. So it's going to more positively grab that stalk and pull that stalk back into the row unit. So one thing you might have noticed on this head is that I don't have the ear savers installed on this head. They've been riding in the toolbox for quite some time now. We had some issues in some dry land corners with the stalk breaking off before it got into the row unit and plugging up at the front of the row. So I took these off, and what I've found is that I don't really see where it makes much difference on loss. So they would mount on there typically like that. That stalk would go in between them, and they would help catch any ears that would bounce back. So I don't see a lot of ear bounce back on this head. Also, if we look at the poly profile on this head, it's a pretty tight profile in here. So when I've got stalks coming in the center of this head, I've seen ears bounce back, hit the stalk, and come into the head. So I don't feel that they're 100% necessary on this head. If we're looking at a down corn situation, I would probably recommend taking them off. It's going to allow that crop to flow a little smoother over the back of this snoot and get into the row unit so that we're not breaking off stalks and having damage. Now, we've had a couple different revisions of the ear saver. The earlier ones were a little stiffer rubber. The later ones are a little bit more flexible rubber. So if you're wanting to keep an ear saver on there, you've got an early head, look at upgrading those ear saver flaps to the ones out of the part book for a late model head built within the last couple of years. If we take our look at our auger and our header, that auger typically comes from the plant set down close to the bottom of the trough. And a couple things I don't like about that setting. Number one, it's more likely to damage that ear. So sometimes when we start looking at damage, we kill stall our machine, we come up here and look in the corn head, we'll find that we're finding those ears that we've wiped the top of that kernel off. And then we're seeing that damage in the tank. So one thing that I've picked up from some of the food grade guys, from some of the popcorn guys, is that they're pretty particular about the height of this auger. So what they want to see is that they can come across this trough and they can slide an ear between the tip of that flighting and the bottom of the trough. So that way, as we're feeding that crop in, we're pushing the ears with another ear. We're not pushing those ears with steel. So it's more of a grain on grain movement to get that crop into the center of the machine and into the feeder house. Now, the other thing I feel like this does by raising this up, if we're getting into those conditions where we're bringing some more stalks in and down corn, we're dealing with some fluff and some trash, by raising this up, it gives me more clearance to get that trash up underneath the auger, to get underneath the auger flight. Now, when we raise our auger up, there's a couple steps to doing that. We'll take a look on the side and the back of the head as far as getting access to that to raise it up. But as we're raising it, we also want to look at its fore-aft position. So we want to keep a pretty uniform distance between the back of the flighting and the stripper angle that runs across the back of the head. That's going to keep that material from wanting to wrap around that auger as it's going toward the center of the head. And when you're looking at that, you want to maintain a pretty much the same clearance from the back of the flighting to the stripper after you raise the auger that you had before you raised the auger. Now, the other thing I've run into with that is sometimes you've got pretty close to the same clearance on the stripper across the side, but there's a couple stripper blocks near the opening of the feeder house that are a plastic block. And you'll sometimes notice when you're running that header, after you raise it all the way up, that auger can sometimes vibrate or bounce towards the feeder house in the raised position, and you'll hear that auger rubbing when you raise it up. So just look for any signs after you've raised the auger that it could be rubbing on the stripper after you've run it with the header raised up. So when we're raising the auger up, we're going to take this end cover off here on either end. That's going to give us access to the bolts that hold that bearing onto the side sheet. We're also going to open up our chain drive housing, and we're going to loosen that tensioner off. That's going to make sure that that tensioner is not trying to pull that auger back towards the back. It makes it a lot easier to adjust that auger. And then what I typically use to raise the auger is I've got a porta power with the wedge on there. I'll slide that wedge underneath the flighting on either end and use that hydraulic wedge to raise that auger up until I can slide an ear between the flighting and the trough of the auger, and then I can lock my bearings back down. So if we take a look at the header as we're going into the feeder house, we've got this adjustable center cover hood on the 4000 series head. So what this does for us is any of that material that could get shelled or kicked back by that feeder house as it's transitioning from the auger into the chain and up the feeder house, this helps eliminate the possibility of that crop getting kicked back out the center of the head and becoming a loss on the ground. So typically, I start off with this in its lowest position, like this one is sitting right now. If I get into a fluff condition where I'm having issues with that material not getting into the feeder house, I will sometimes raise this up. So we've got one bolt on the end down here. We can take that bolt out, and we've got a number of different positions that we can set this. So there are 2 bolt holes in here, an upper and a lower, as well as 3 bolt holes here. Now, the other thing that we can do as well is we can fold this all the way back and we can put the bolt through here to basically take it out of the equation. Now, that is going to block your line of sight a little bit, but if you're just doing a little bit of down corn in a field, you may want to flip that back to go ahead and get through that area of the field and get done, and then you can flip it back down if need be later. Now, the other thing that we have available through parts is we've got these rubber flaps. So if we look, we've got this angle on the header, and we can mount 2 of these rubber flaps on either side. So I typically start by mounting a flap in the outside position on either side. And what that flap will do is it comes around, is it's going to help grab some of that light fluffy material, some of those stalks, pull them underneath the auger and get them into the feeder house. I typically start with this before I raise this up. So by adding this, but keeping this in its lowest position to help grab that crop and get it into the feeder house, it's going to eliminate the possibility of throwing some grain back over in this area right here. Now, if you do have these on, one disadvantage of them is if you don't need them, they can sometimes kick that material, kick an ear back out every now and then, kick a little bit of shelled grain out every now and then. So I typically keep them in the toolbox. Last year they rode all year in the toolbox. The year before they came out for one field. But I only use them if I have to use them, and I take them off the rest of the time. As you can see, they do wear a little bit over time. So by only using them when you need them, you're going to get a little bit longer life out of them. When we take a look at our snoot adjustment, what we want to see is that these snoots, basically we could pull a straight line across them when the header's sitting there static. That's a good starting point typically. Once we get the head down into harvest position, especially those positions closer to the ground, depending on what we've set the angle of our header, we want to get the height of these adjusted so we're kind of riding more to the back of this skid plate. We don't want to be constantly spearing the front of the snoot in the ground. We want it to kind of be riding at the back, and the snoot to be lifting that crop up. So as we go across the head and look, we've got the adjustments where we can adjust that snoot height. So there is a pin on the back here that I can remove, and I can raise and lower this assembly here, as well as there is a bolt at the back of that assembly where I can fine tune that adjustment. So if I see one hole in either direction for a particular snoot does not get me in line with the other ones, I may need to adjust that bolt. Or if I'm in a down corn condition, I may find that I can adjust that bolt and kind of fine tune those snoots so they're as close as I can get them to the ground, not spearing in the ground, but getting that crop lifted up for me. We talked a little bit when we were looking at the gathering chains and timing them about it might be worthwhile to run across this head with that tool and check and make sure all those idlers are free. So talk a little bit about a few other pre-season checks that we can take a look at on this header. And one would be to go through and look at our snoots. So make sure all of those snoots move freely through their range of movement. No tight spots, no binding, no rubbing, anything like that. As well as also looking at the hardware back here where the pivot point is, making sure we don't have loose hardware, worn hardware, anything like that, especially if we're working in a down corn condition, could create any binding or anything like that that could lead to a snoot getting run into the ground. The other thing that we can look at down here where we've got our latch on there is make sure that latch is engaging fully. And then this is also adjustable in this latch striker. So I typically recommend loosening these bolts here a little bit, taking a hammer or something, tapping down on that latch so that we've got this back hood to where we got most of the wiggle out. You can see mine with a little bit of wear has got a little bit of wiggle in here. So I would probably adjust that down before harvest. Less chance of that latch popping loose on there on me. Also minimizing my gap in here that could create some crop loss or some hairpinning of some of that trash. Other items to take a look at pre-season would be looking at our cones on the front of our stock rolls, inspecting them from wear, comparing them with a new one. As they start to wear, we're going to be less likely to pull that material into the row unit and could lead to additional breaking. Looking at our cutting edge on our knives, making sure that cutting edge is sharp, not starting to wear down. We did just release a new knife this year for model year 21 that will be available through parts, and that will be for both the narrow and the standard row corn heads. And the difference with that knife is the standard knife on these heads was a carbide coated. That will be a tungsten carbide coated, so it's a hard surfacing. We also changed from a flame hardening process to an induction hardening process on the knife itself, so we get a little bit better hardening on that knife. Other items to look at would be to go through and check our oil level in our gearboxes and change that oil level if it's been a while on that. Especially if we're doing down corn, we're working that gearbox a little bit harder. We want to make sure that going into harvest that we've got the right amount of oil in there and that it's clean, so it's going to protect that gearbox through harvest. If you've got chopping row units, you also have a check plug on them as well that you can check and fill the levels on those chopping row units separately from the main row unit. When we're looking at the end dividers on the head, if we go into a down corn situation, we also want to flatten them out as much as possible. So if you've got the tall corn kit on there, these heads had an optional fold up poly tall corn kit. You're going to want to fold that down to allow that crop to slide over this end snoot. Go back to your older 10 series heads with that bolt-on sheet metal. Takes a little bit of time, but taking that sheet metal off can improve that performance in a down corn situation. So this head has the factory installed roller cone augers on the end of it. These tie in with the reel circuit on the combine. I can use my auto reel speed to speed these up and slow them down as I'm going through the field. I can also take my reel speed adjustment potentiometer, turn it all the way down, and even turn these off as I'm running if I'm in a situation where I see that I don't need them. And we'll take a look at going in the display, how to set them up, and how to adjust the speed on them. Now this is going to help us in that down corn situation, because instead of that crop wanting to lay on the sides or the end dividers here, it's going to help pull that crop back and get it into the header. It's got a stripper plate on the bottom down here that's going to prevent it from wrapping with morning glories or anything like that. And we do offer a tall corn kit that will go with this as well. So that kind of gives you the best of both worlds of having this auger on here plus having a tall corn kit. If you get into good standing corn where you're losing the ears and you're seeing an ear bounce out the side here. So with that tall corn kit is a replacement for this stripper plate. It's got a little piece of sheet metal that comes up in this area here, and it's got 4 quarter turn latches on there where we have a piece of sheet metal that will clip on here when we need it. When we don't need it, we can unclip it and put it in the truck. We're on the other side of the head now, taking a look at the other roller cone or hydraulic end divider on this head. One issue I did run into one year doing some down corn, some weak brittle stalk corn, was I was having issues with that getting back to the back and either going off the back, hanging up around the motor, things like that. So what I did to get through that situation, and I've never undone it since I did it, was I used these 5/8 lock washers. So I just took a lock washer and a pair of pliers, lined it up with the flighting and drove it onto the flighting. So you can see I've got about 4 of them staggered throughout here, and to get them on there I had to take that stripper bar off down here. But what that did for me is it creates a little bit of a kicker. So as that material is coming back on this auger, that lock washer grabs it, throws it into the head. Now, downside of that is I get into a morning glory situation or something like that, it can make it want to wrap that auger where I don't have that stripper plate on there anymore. So if you look at our newer heads, the narrow row heads, what we've done on them is we've put a reverse flighting back here, and then we've got a flat bar kicker here. So as that crop comes to the back, it hits that kicker, the kicker tries to kick it in. If the kicker doesn't get it, the reverse flighting pushes it back forward a little bit. So if you wanted to leave the stripper bar on but make a modification to this auger that would help it kick that crop in, what we could do is come in here and weld a piece of 1-inch flat bar in here that would be about the same height as this flighting, that once that crop got back towards the back, it would go ahead and kick that in. The flat bar in between the flighting is going to clear the stripper bar, and we're not going to have any issues with material wanting to wrap this auger like we do with the lock washer method. Take a look at a few things in our display as far as going in and turning our hydraulic driven augers on our end dividers on, as well as taking a look at the auto feeder speed. So If we go to our back menu and our toolbox, when we come into our header 2 and we scroll down, we've got the selection for reel drive type that we want to see on hydraulic, as well as reel end dividers that we want turned on. So that is going to have the reel drive valve send hydraulic flow out there to those augers. Now, if you've got if you don't have the augers and you have a corn reel, or you have the augers in conjunction with a corn reel, you would want to turn that on as well for your corn reel. Now, when we put a corn reel on the front, it does get a little bit complicated if we've got a corn reel that we can raise and lower. Right now, there's no functionality to run the reel circuit for the height adjustment when the corn head is on here. So what we can do is we can do a new header type, select OK, and in our header type up here, if we leave it on not defined, we're able to select our row type as our cutting type as a row instead of a platform. We're able to come down here and set our header width. Set our target work width. We can turn auto cut width on if we've got our GPS receiver. And then we can come in this screen and set up our other items. So that is going to make the reel raise lower circuit active to where you're still going to be cutting as a row style header, but would be able to raise and lower that corn reel if you need to. Now, the other thing we're going to take a look at while we're in here is we're going to go over to the feeder tab. And one of the unique features on the flagship machines is that with the CVT drive, we have the ability to vary that feeder speed. So we can infinitely vary that feeder speed with the CVT drive. And with that, if we look down on our armrest, next to my feeder speed adjustment, I've got an auto switch. So that's going to work pretty much the same as my auto reel will, in that when I turn that on, when I've got the corn head on here, as I speed up and slow down my machine, it's going to speed up and slow down that feeder house. So that's a nice feature in down corn. We can get that speed adjusted where we're not pulling that crop through too fast when we're running slower in the down conditions. But we're getting it through the row unit fast enough to get the ear snapped off and to get it fed. And then if we get into some standing corn and we speed back up in that 5-6 mile an hour range, it's going to automatically speed that header back up for me. So there is a little bit of setup with that in the feeder tab, and this gets overlooked a lot of times. People don't come in here and set their minimum and their maximum auto feeder speed. So a complaint I get sometimes is that the customer tried running auto feeder speed, he turned around on the end and the header's running wide open. So the way I've been running it on this machine is setting my minimum at 2 miles an hour and my maximum at 5 miles per hour. So then as I speed up and slow down, it's going to adjust me between those two speeds. So my typical feeder speed, if I had a fixed feeder, would be around 560 RPMs. Typically that speed will work pretty good on this head in that 5 to 6 miles per hour range. So typically I'm going to set my max around 5. I'm going to adjust when I'm running at 5 miles per hour my feeder speed so that I'm around that 560 to 580 RPM range. And then as I slow down, it's going to drop my feeder speed down as I get closer to this 2 miles per hour. Now when we're configured for the corn head, if we go into our header 1 tab and scroll down, we do have 2 options here for how we're running that CVT. So if we select nominal, it's going to put us around that fixed 560 RPMs. We can select the lower range that's going to run us from our minimum CVT speed up a little closer to 600 RPMs, or we can select full range. So full range is going to get us up over 600 RPMs on that feeder speed. So and you can use either one of these, just kind of depends on how hard you need to run the speed on that header to get the crop through there. I have typically found that I can run in the lower range and I'm able to use my auto feeder and my speed adjust and get that speed where I want it to be. So as I slow down, it gets a little slower. As I speed up, it gets a little faster. But I'm typically not seeing with the 4000 series corn heads that I've got to go typically much over about 580 RPMs max. Maybe some varieties you might see that you're up a little closer to 6, but not like some of the competitive heads where we've got to be 600 plus RPM on that feeder speed. We'll take a quick look at how that auto feeder speed works. Right now I'm sitting still with the header running. My feeder speed is 420 RPMs, got 0 miles an hour. So as I start to speed up, we're going to start to see that feeder speed start to come up once I get above 2 miles per hour. And as I head up towards that 5 miles per hour that I've got my max set at. See, once I get to 5, I'm about 540 RPMs. I can speed that speed up with my speed switch if I need to. And then it's going to follow that ground speed as I speed up and slow down. So with my hydraulically driven end dividers, I can also use my auto reel speed on them to make them speed up as my machine speeds up and slow down as I slow down. The other thing that I can do with them, if I decide I don't need them, don't want them to spin, if I turn my reel speed all the way to its minimum setting, you can see the divider will quit running at that point and basically be sitting there static. So this header does have our Generation 2 row guidance system on it. It is a single sensor system as opposed to our earlier row guide systems that ran one sensor under 2 snoots and had 2 separate sensors. The nice thing about this system is if you get into volunteer corn conditions, weed conditions, you don't have to worry about a stalk of volunteer corn or a weed hitting that single sensor and wanting it to run offline. Since we're bracing off or running off of 2 separate rows, if I have a weed that hits on one side, a piece of volunteer corn that hits on one side, it basically just knocks it over and we keep following that row. So this is a useful tool when we get into down corn. I've done a little bit of down corn with this. It does work pretty well at keeping you on that row. Now one thing I have found when we're harvesting down corn, in a lot of conditions, being right there on the row does help get that crop into the row unit, help get it fed into the machine. Now, if you're dealing with crop that is laid over perpendicular to the row, I have found that sometimes instead of running right dead center of the row, if it's leaning that way and I offset that crop over this direction a little bit, I can kind of lean that crop and get it to stand up as it's going into that row unit. So you may find that offsetting the row a little bit might help you, especially if it's leaning kind of in one direction with the row. You may be able to get off of that row a little bit, use the snoot to lift that crop up, and it might save you from having to harvest in a single direction in the field and deadheading back to the other end. So hopefully this video will help you out getting through harvest, especially if you've got some tough conditions. Give you a few pointers and tips as far as getting that header dialed in and making it perform to its best. Especially if you've got some down corn to get through this year, that can be a especially frustrating process to get through. And as you can see here, sometimes you don't always have the best day. So this happened to me early in the morning in down corn. Hung a gopher mound with the tip of the snoot and bent it under. So don't get frustrated. Have some patience. You can get through getting those down crops into the machine. You may have to experiment a little bit with different times of the day as far as harvesting. I've found in some cases if the material gets dry and brittle that harvesting late in the day or early in the morning when it picks up a little bit of moisture might result in it feeding into the head or not breaking off at the base of the plant as much and work a little bit better.